Hi, my name is Pam Sherratt. I'm the Sports Turf Specialist at The Ohio State University, and I'm going to talk about sports turf management. So what is sports turf management? Well, sports turf really refers to anything outside of golf course management. So football fields, baseball, lacrosse, field hockey, lawn bowling, etc. All those different types of sports, athletic fields that are outside of golf. That's what we mean when we say sports turf. One of the most popular games that's played across the world is football, and that has quite an interesting history. It was introduced by the Romans, and the original game consisted of two different villages competing to get a ball from one village to the next without the people from that village stopping them. And it was actually quite a rowdy game, and people actually got killed and maimed during the game. Nothing like it is today, of course. And the terminology of the game football obviously is different depending on where you live. In the United States, obviously, the game of American football is played. Australia rules football in Australia. There's Gaelic football in Ireland. Association football is referred to as soccer in the United States. It's referred to as football outside the United States, but the official term is association football, and the word soccer comes from an abbreviation of the word association. One of the interesting things about the history of some of these sports is that they were once considered a conflict of national interest. Certainly in the UK around the time of Henry VIII, where the king wanted people to practice things like archery that would be useful in warfare. They really didn't want people out doing things like lawn bowling and playing football. So some of them were actually banned. Some of those sports were banned back in the old days. But looking at history of sports turf management, as far back as the late 15th century, fields, or pitches as they're referred to in Europe, were actually starting to be marked out and boundaries were laid as far as, rectangles or squares that they were played on. And then by the 1800s, regulations and rules of the game came into play and were written. And the first club was in the UK at Cambridge, which is a university there, and the first official game was in the Pennsylvania in the US in 1895. So this is American football. As you can see, this is a synthetic turf that's being played on right now in Ohio Stadium, but this is the game of American football. Outside of the US, this is also termed football. This is obviously association football, or soccer as it's referred to, and we'll talk about the difference between management of soccer fields versus American football fields. One of the other big sports that's played obviously is baseball, baseball and softball. Majority of the work that takes place on a baseball field is in the infield, on the dirt or the clay. Only about 30% of a groundsman's or groundsperson's time is spent looking after grass. The majority of their time is spent managing the dirt or the clay infield. Some of the more uncommon sports that aren't played by too many people but are still very interesting sports, things like lawn bowling and lawn tennis. This is the All England Lawn Tennis Club in Wimbledon. Synthetic turf has obviously been gaining popularity since the late 90s. Synthetic turf is basically an artificial grass carpet that's laid over concrete, and then that carpet is backfilled or filled up with sand and rubber to make it, the sand weighs it down and the rubber makes it soft for athletes to play on. The role of the groundsman or the sports field manager has really changed over the years. They're no longer just expected to mow grass and throw some fertilizer out. The majority are facility managers, so they have to oversee rock concerts, corporate events, ceremonies, weddings. They have to be able to put together and manage something like this. So it's not just about managing grass anymore, it's really more about managing the whole facility. Looking a little bit at the evolution of how we managed turf back in the old days, where they used to use sheep to graze on the grass to keep it short on the old Scottish golf links courses, or they used to cut the grass with scythes. We've come a long way since then. One of the things that really revolutionised the turf grass management industry was the introduction of the reel mower, the mower by Edward Budding in 1830. There's a picture of the original mower there on the left. And then some of the other advances, obviously, fertilizer, being able to use a granular fertilizer rather than having to, put out cow manure or horse manure. That was huge. The fertilizers were introduced by the Scott's Company in Marysville back in the early 1920s. And then since then, obviously, we've had advances in weed control, disease control, insect control, mechanical equipment like aerators and scarifiers that you'll see later have also somewhat revolutionized the industry. So back in the 70s, 80s, 90s, it wouldn't have been unusual to watch a game on TV and see it, a mud bath, standing water, muddy conditions, players covered in mud. We've come a long way since then even. If you do watch Premiership soccer games, or you watch American football games or baseball games, the majority of those fields now look as good on the last day of the season as they did on the first day of the season. So our technology has come so far in the equipment and the products that we have that it really has become a very high-tech industry. Sports turf as a profession, what do our graduates go on and do? Well, they can become a head grounds person, a field manager of a facility like a stadium. A facility manager is they could be in charge of, for example, a Parks and Rec facility where they might have 20 baseball fields, 15 soccer fields, lacrosse, etc. They may be an assistant somewhere, which is basically the second in command on any one of those facilities. Marketing and sales is obviously huge for the amount of equipment and products now that we have in the turf grass management industry. And then some of our graduates will go on into academia and go into research, teaching or extension. So we have students that are grounds or field managers or facility managers at places like Major League Soccer stadiums, Major League Baseball stadiums, NFL stadiums, Parks and Rec facilities, polo facilities. They can be a consultant, they can sell products. So we have a whole range of different careers across the sports turf industry. The sports turf industry, or the turf grass industry, is worth a lot of money to the economy, and between 40 and 60 billion dollars across the United States. So it's a huge industry. There's over 50 million acres of turf across the United States. So we'll just look at Ohio. The Ohio economy, about $4.6 billion goes from the turf grass industry and contributes to the Ohio economy. Over 40,000 people are employed in turf grass in the state. We've got over 4 million acres of turf in the state of Ohio. This is a census that was done back in 2008, and they were found that there was 267 million people in the United States that are age 7 and above, and about 80 million people are regularly playing sports on turf. This is a breakdown of those sports. As you can see, about 25 million people play golf, and then 15 million people play baseball and soccer, and about 12 million play softball, and about 10 million people play football. So that's a huge amount of people, 80 million people playing sports on turf. So it obviously does have an economic benefit, and it also has a health benefit to many people. In Ohio, we have about 34,000 acres of athletic turf in the state. We have over 700 golf courses. This is Westerville's, one of Westerville's high school's baseball fields. In addition to the economics and the health benefits, obviously, we're going to look at some of the benefits. Why do we have sports fields? Why are they important? Well, obviously, they're important for the environment. They're important for sports and recreation, and they're important as a function of our urban living. The number one environmental reason for turf, obviously, is soil stabilization. It's a perennial ground cover, and it can be mowed. Many years have been spent trying to look for alternatives to turf. People want to have an alternative to turf grasses. They don't want to mow it. They think it's high maintenance. What can we have that's an alternative? Well, there really isn't anything out there. Why is turf grass so special? Well, because the number one thing that sets it apart from other plants is that it can be mowed and not die. So we can chop this plant, we can chop the top off this plant and it won't die. It's perennial, it's a ground cover, it can stabilize soil, it can be mowed, and it can withstand traffic from people, from dogs, from kids. So it's hard wearing, and it can withstand mowing, and it's perennial. So this is what makes it such a great plant as far as soil stabilization, erosion control. So obviously we want to avoid situations like this. If there was turf grass on this, we would not see water and soil getting into that drain. And there's been many runoff studies over the years, Wisconsin, Minnesota, New York, to name a few, showing that turf grass, because it's a perennial crop that's a dense ground cover, it does prevent not just water runoff and sediment runoff, but also nutrient runoff. One of the other things that turf is good for is to sequester or store carbon. We obviously pump carbon dioxide into the atmosphere by burning fossil fuels, and by running cars and aeroplanes and having feedlots and doing all these other things we do to pump carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Our levels are increasing, obviously. One of the things that plants like trees and shrubs and turf can do is to store carbon in their underground storage systems and in the actual plant. 66% of the turfgrass plant is actually below ground, and that soil organic carbon can be captured in that organic matter underground. So an athletic field should be able to store about 700 pounds of carbon. A nice way of saying that, or an easy way of saying that, would be one soccer field can store enough carbon to offset a car being driven 3,000 miles. But obviously the amount of amount of carbon a plant can store also depends on the amount of carbon it takes to take care of that plant. So if you are mowing it, and obviously if you use a gas mower, we've had to burn fossil fuels to make that gasoline. So we have these inputs which require us to burn fossil fuels, and that the burning of fossil fuels releases carbon in the atmosphere. So what we need to do to be sustainable is to limit and to be very careful about the amount of input that we put into the turf, to make sure that the amount of care that the turf needs is not greater than the amount of carbon that turf can store. And we know from experience and from research that if a turf grass is managed properly, it can store more carbon than it takes to take care of that turf. Another thing that turf does is to cool the environment and the immediate environment around the turf. A typical lawn, Kentucky bluegrass lawn, has about 9 million individual leaves, or shoots we call them. Golf green would have about 72 million. And what happens when the turf grass on a hot sunny day, it will transpire, it will sweat. You'll get this pull of water up from the roots through the plant, and then that water will exit via the stomatal openings in the leaf. And as that water exits the leaf, it immediately cools the environment around that plant. So we can have, in an urban heat sink where we have lots of houses in a city and we don't have much green space, we can have a 10-degree difference in heat in the urban environment versus somebody living, in the countryside. If we have green space in an urban environment, it can significantly lower that temperature, that urban temperature. This is research that was done at Brigham Young, showing that on an 81-degree day, the natural grass is either about the same as ambient air or slightly lower at 78 degrees compared to all the other synthetic or hard surfaces that could be, as hot as 117 degrees. Moving on from the environmental benefits, obviously sports and recreation is a huge benefit to mankind. There are, as I said, 80 million people that play sports on turf. The Centre for Disease Control estimates that 17% of American children and adolescents are obese. And obviously we cannot downplay the role that outdoor green space and athletic fields can play in trying to prevent that epidemic of obesity with kids and youth in the United States. So we need to give them places to play soccer, to play frisbee, to walk the dog, to play golf. We have to have this urban green space to offer our children and the youth and our adults somewhere to get fresh air and to get exercise. So many parks and rec facilities will have league sports, and obviously there's a lot of golf courses that will offer sports as well. There could be intramural sports or NCAA sports, etc. But we can't downplay the importance of getting kids away from video games and away from the TV and getting them outside for fresh air and for exercise. Turfgrass, if you look at the urban environment, is everywhere. It's on the side of riverbanks to stop water and salts and hazard wastes getting into the water. It acts as a biofilter. It's used in the urban environment to cool the environment down, as I said. It just improves the quality of life for people. People want to see green space. They want to use green space. They want to lie on it and play frisbee on it, have cookouts on it. They want to be able to walk their dogs, exercise, get exercise for themselves and their children. So we need green space in the urban environment. So as you stop listening to this and you go outside, look and just see just how much turf grass or green space there is outside, and it's especially important in the urban environment that we continue to develop green space. What are some of the issues, the challenges, the problems in sports turf management? Well, it's a little bit different to golf. First of all, in sports turf management, we have what we call we can have a micro environment, which basically means, for example, in a stadium where you have walls and a roof, we create these environments where there's very little sunlight, very little air movement. These micro environments are created that are quite difficult to manage. It's difficult to manage and grow plants in darkness and with no air movement. So there's been technologies over the years that have improved that we'll talk about. A lot of our sports are played at times of year that is not good for turfgrass growth. So we play sports in winter, we play sports during inclement weather, and that can be a challenge in sports turf management. We have a lot of traffic and wear. Our athletes will wear cleats, and some of these athletes are very large, very muscular. They push into the grass, they slide across the grass, create a lot of traffic. And then one of the issues we have in sports turf management is the type of soil or dirt that the grass is grown on. We obviously have to have something that drains freely so that we don't have a mud bath during a game. So we use a lot of sand, which we'll talk about. Unfortunately, sand is not stable. It'd be like trying to play football on a beach. Trying to run on sand, it's very unstable. So that's one of the issues we have in sports turf, is trying to overcome that drainage versus stability issue as far as the dirt that we grow our grasses on. And the issues are a little bit different in golf. As you can see, they have a huge acreage to take care of, and they have very intensely managed areas that have a lot of disease and drought and other stress. And obviously green speed is something that every golfer wants to know what that is and how they can get that improved. But we're just going to concentrate on sports turf and some of the challenges that we have in that. This concludes the slideshow for the sports turf overview.